Good day to all. Welcome to Practical Research 2. We are already on week 7 of our module. I will be your teacher for this subject. So my name is Sir Relly D. Castro. So before we start, let's read the general instructions. You have to answer all the questions, drills, activities, and assessment on a separate sheet of paper, which will be submitted in a designated drop box. Include your name, grade and section, part of the module you are answering, date of submission, and complete answer for all the tasks given. Also, have your answer sheet signed by your parents. There is no need for you to copy the question on the answer sheet. Just make sure that you follow the instructions properly and write your answers legibly. In doing this, follow this template or example below. Our topic for today is Conceptual Framework, an illustration of the research study. At the end of this module, you should be able to first describe the different models of conceptual framework commonly used in research studies, determine the steps in writing the conceptual framework, appreciate the basic concepts and useful benefits of conceptual framework, and construct a conceptual framework applying the knowledge and skills in writing research. Okay, so before we start with the lesson proper, you're going to be doing pre-activities. For the first activity, the direction is underline the best answer from the given statements. So for this particular activity, you're going to be reading the statement for each number, and you're going to be choosing the correct answer from the choices given within the parentheses. Okay, so underline your answer. Okay, and for the next activity, so the directions for this is for items number 11 to 15. Arrange in chronological order the following steps. Write 1 for the first step, 2 for the second, 3 for the third, 4 for the fourth, and 5 for the last step on the space provided before the number. So you're going to be arranging the steps, okay, for from number 11 to 15. So you just write your answers on the given space. For next activity, so the directions is identify if the given statement is true or false. So place a check mark on the appropriate box that corresponds to your answer. So this is a simple true or false question. So you have 5 questions here. You put a check on the corresponding box if it's true, or you put a check again in the corresponding box if it's false. For our next activity, so the direction is analyze the illustration and selection below, then answer the guide question that follows. So you're going to be analyzing the two pictures. So we have two pictures here. So there are two builders. The upper picture shows the man whose house was built on the rock, and the lower picture shows the man whose house was built on sand. So upon analyzing the pictures, you're also going to be reading a selection. Okay, so the title of the selection is The Parable of the Two Builders. So let me read it for you. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So that is the parable of the two builders. So upon analyzing the two pictures and also reading the parable of the two builders, I want you to answer the guide questions. Okay, now let's proceed with our lesson proper. So the topic that we're going to be talking for today will be conceptual framework. Conceptual framework. So the following terms are important for you to understand conceptual framework. So before we proceed with the discussion proper itself, pag-usapan muna natin yung importanteng terms na may encounter natin during our discussion. Specifically, tinatawag natin na conceptual framework. So, dito, let's talk about what is a concept and what is a framework. Kasi yun yung combination nung ating topic. So, pag sinabi nating framework, framework is a basic conceptual structure, and it also refers to a skeletal open work or structural frame. A frame is a structure intended to support a building, a vehicle, or an object. It also shows how each part is interrelated to one another to be able to serve its purpose. So, framework is frame. Okay, so it is where it is considered to be as a structure kung saan nag-a-adhere yung buong structure mismo. It is something that actually supports a structure. For example, sa tao. Okay, tao, ano ba yung framework natin? Our framework is our skeletal system. So, it is a structure that supports the whole human being. Okay, another good example is yung pagpapatayo kayo ng bahay, di ba, bago itayo yung bahay, gumagawa muna tayo ng mga frameworks. Okay, kung saan doon kakapit yung iba pang structure ng bahay natin. Now, ano naman yung tinatawag natin na concept? Concept is something conceived in the mind. It is an abstract or generic idea generalized from particular instances. So, concept is basically an idea. An idea na naisip natin. Okay? So, yun yung tinatawag natin na concept. Now, another thing na kailangan din natin malaman is the difference between a conceptual framework and also a conceptual paradigm. Ano ba yung tinatawag natin na conceptual framework in the context of research? So, conceptual framework is an outline on how to proceed with the research study. It gives direction to the research study being undertaken. So, kagaya nga nung diniscuss natin kanina about framework, it is an outline. Okay? Yung conceptual framework natin, ginagawa natin ito to serve as an outline or structure or guide or which give us direction or how are we going to be proceeding on our research study. It also shows the relationship of your variables involved and illustrates the research design of the study. So basically, also in conceptual framework, pinapakita natin dito on how our variables are related. How your independent and dependent variable are related to one another. And also, in a conceptual framework, ini-illustrate din natin dito what particular research design of the study are we going to be using. Now, it is a basic structure with generic ideas generalized from existing body of knowledge. That is why it is anchored to the theoretical framework of the study. In most cases, gumagawa tayo ng conceptual framework that is anchored on a particular theory. Okay? Or on a particular body of knowledge. Yes, nagko-conceptualize tayo ng idea pag gumagawa tayo ng conceptual framework, but still, kailangan naka-anchor pa rin siya doon sa specific body of knowledge na related doon sa topic of study natin. Okay. Ano naman yung tinatawag natin na conceptual paradigm? So, conceptual paradigm is basically your conceptual framework. The only difference is your conceptual paradigm is the diagram itself or the visual illustration. Kung saan makikita natin visually, okay, kung ano yung ibig natin ipahatid using our conceptual framework. So, yun yung tinatawag natin na conceptual paradigm. So, it also presents variable that is related with one another based on the research ideas before the actual exploration of its relationship. So, kaya sinabi ko sa inyo, the conceptual paradigm is the visual representation of your conceptual framework. Okay, now let's talk about the purposes of conceptual framework. Bakit ba kailangan natin gumawa ng conceptual framework in a research study? So we have several reasons why. Number one, to clarify concept and show the relationship with one another. In a conceptual framework kasi, or a conceptual paradigm, pinapakita natin yung relationship ng different concepts and different variables of our study. How one variable is related to one another. So that is one of the purposes of conceptual framework para makita ng reader natin ano ba ang relasyon ng independent variable and dependent variable of our study. Now, pangalawa, to provide a context to help in the interpretation of data. Now, we use the conceptual framework, or we formulate rather a conceptual framework in order for us to contextualize or to help us for easy interpretation of data. Kasi pag gumagawa tayo ng conceptual framework, present din yung research design na ginamit natin. Okay? So because of that, it's going to be easier for us to interpret rather our data. Pangatlo, to illustrate observations made by the researcher before actual investigation. So ginagamit din natin yung conceptual framework natin para i-illustrate natin yung observations natin or yung gagawin nating observation even before, okay, even before nagawin natin yung actual investigation. Pang-apat, to encourage development of theory that is useful. Now, we conceptualize our framework, or again, we formulate our conceptual framework, which in turn can be utilized as a form of theory by itself. Pwedeng yung conceptual framework mo, pwedeng maging theory yon by itself, or we can anchor it to another theory. Okay, and number 5, to easily show readers the components of the study at a glance. Now, of course, pag gumagawa tayo ng research natin, in most cases, binabasa yan ng mga readers natin, di ba? So, yung conceptual framework is one of the ways para makita nila kung ano ba yung components or nilalaman ng research natin just by looking at it. So, those are the primary purposes of your conceptual framework. Okay, now let's talk about the three major models of conceptual framework. So there are three major models commonly used in the research studies. So ano yung tatlo na yon? So number 1, you have your IVDV framework. Number 2, you have your IVMV, IVDV framework. And number 3, you have your IPO framework. So ito yung tatlong pinaka-common na ginagamit natin in the research studies. However, making a conceptual framework is not limited to these three. So meron pang mga iba na pwede natin gamitin. Okay? So, itong tatlo na to, yung common na ginagamit. So, ito yung pag-uusapan natin for today. Okay, so unahin natin yung IVDV framework. Now, ano ba yung IVDV framework natin? Now, IV stands for independent variable and DV stands for dependent variable. This is mostly used for descriptive research or other non-experimental research studies. So, in an IVDV framework, pinapakita natin directly yung relationship ng independent variable of the study sa dependent variable of the study. So, karaniwan itong ginagamit in descriptive research or non-experimental research. So, here is a good example of an IVDV framework. So, kung makikita nyo, napakasimple lang. So, ang pinapakita natin relationship ng independent variable dito with the arrow sign. Okay? So, for example, sa independent variable natin is social media, frequency of usage, and time allotment. And sa dependent variable natin, students' mental health during the pandemic. So basically, dito ay pinapakita natin kung paano nga ba nakaka-apekto ang social media, specifically yung frequency of usage at saka time allotment sa mental health ng mga estudyante during the pandemic. So, as simple as that, the relationship between your independent variable and dependent variable, which is represented in a very simple illustration. So, yun yung unang format natin, yung IVDV format. Okay. Now, the second type of your framework is your IVMB/IVDV framework. So, it is very similar, or it's a variation of your IVDV framework. It's almost the same. Meron lang siyang pinagkaiba kung mapapansin nyo. As you can see, there is another variable in the middle. So, merong variable sa gitna ng IV at saka ng DV. So, ano yun? Yung tinatawag natin na MV/IV or mediating variable or intervening variable. Now, yung mediating variable or intervening variable, ito yung tinatawag natin na stand between variable. Okay, kasi nandun siya sa gitna ng independent variable at saka ng dependent variable. Bakit nandun siya? Nandun siya kasi ipinapaliwanag niya kung ano nga ba ang relationship ng independent variable sa dependent variable. At Okay? So here's a good example of that. So sa independent variable natin, kagaya ng ginamit natin kanina, so social media, frequency of usage, and time allotment, paano ito nakaka-apekto doon sa ating students' mental health during the pandemic, which is your dependent variable. Aside from that, meron din tayong intervening variable or yung stand between variable. So ano yun? Social media platform use, reasons for using social media. So, it can affect, pwedeng maka-apekto yung intervening variable natin sa ating dependent variable. So, it explains also the relationship between your independent variable and the independent variable. So, yung tinatawag natin na intervening variable. Okay. Now, the third type of your framework is yung tinatawag natin na IPO framework. Now, ano ibig sabihin ng IPO framework? I stands for input, P for process, and O stands for output. Now, yung ating IVDV kanina, ginagamit natin yung usually in descriptive research, di ba? Descriptive research or non-experimental research. Yung IPO framework naman, ginagamit natin to usually in action research and experimental research. So, the input is usually the independent variable or the one you are working on. The process includes instruments and analysis used, and the output is the solution to solve the main problem of the study. So, basically, in an IPO framework, pinapakita natin yung independent variable natin at the beginning at yung process involved. Okay, yung process, yun yung mga instruments and analysis na gagamitin natin, and also the possible output or solution para ma-solve yung problem of the study. So here is a good example of the IPO. So you have your input, you have your process, and you have your output. So sa input, social media usage of students. Sa process, so anong instrument ang gagamitin? Profiling, data gathering, and data analysis. And what are the possible output? Detoxification of students from social media. So again, this is commonly used in action research or experimental research. So those are the three common types of framework. Okay, now let's talk about the steps in writing the conceptual framework. Paano nga ba isinusulat or ginagawa ang conceptual framework? So we have 5 steps. So step 1, choose a topic. Step 2, do your literature review. Step 3, identify your variables. Step 4, create your conceptual framework. And step 5, do the narrative. So isa-isahin natin. Okay? So start with choose your topic. So ito, nagawa na natin to. Choose your topic. In choosing a research topic, always keep in mind that it should be within your field of specialization or your field of interest. So, nagawa na natin to before pa. Diba? So, before you start your research, diba, sabi ko nga sa inyo, you have to choose your topic. And take note that your topic should be within your field of specialization. So, kung STEM students ka, choose a topic na related sa STEM. Kung yung students ka, choose a topic that is related to HUBs kasi yun yung mga specialization nyo. Bakit? To make it easier for you to conduct the study. Okay? Now, step 2 is do a literature review. Search for relevant studies to your research, use reliable sources and proper documentation of the information you find, list down the references for future use. So, why do we have to do a literature review? So, we do a literature review in order for us to build up our knowledge. Para mapalawak natin yung knowledge natin with regards sa topic na gagawa natin ng research natin. Even though na ang napili yung topic is within your field of specialization, there are still information that may be lacking. So, ito yung mga kailangan nating kuhanin. Okay? In doing your literature review, wag nyo kakalimutan na ilista or take down or list down the references na ginamit nyo. Okay. The third one is you have to identify the important variables. Clearly identify the independent and dependent variables of your study. From the studies you have found, if any, also include intervening or moderating variables. So again, another important steps in making your conceptual framework or basically in making your research itself is for you to identify your variables. Importante na alam mo kung ano ba ang variables ng study mo. Which variables is the independent variable, which variables are the dependent variable. And sometimes, di ba, kailangan pa natin malaman yung extraneous variables and even your intervening or moderating variables. Step 4, of course, is this is the time that you're going to be generating your conceptual framework. So focus on your variables. Using the variables you found in your literature review that you identified as important, you can now build your conceptual framework. Problem statement serves as reference in constructing your framework. The important variables in your study is found here. Okay, so basically, pag na-identify mo na yung variables mo, alam mo kung ano yung independent, alam mo kung ano yung dependent, you have already construct your statement of the problem, pag bubuuin mo lang yon into something that can be easily identified into an illustration o yung tinatawag natin na conceptual framework. Okay? And of course, the last one is you have to do the narrative. This is the textual explanation of your paradigm. It consists of lines, arrows, and shapes. You have to elaborate each detail. Now, even though nagawa mo na yung conceptual framework mo, may framework ka na, kung mapapansin mo, conceptual framework mo, it's composed of arrows, shapes, mga signs, you still have to explain it. So, below, na conceptual framework mo, kailangan ipaliwanag mo pa rin kung ano ba yung nilalaman ng conceptual framework. So, those are the 5 steps in constructing your conceptual framework. Okay, so that concludes our lesson proper. Now, we proceed to your post activity. So, we have several post activity that you have to accomplish. So, for your first activity, the direction is provided below is a checklist about conceptual framework. Place a check mark on the appropriate box that corresponds to your answer. So, it's just it's a simple yes or no. So, sasagutan nyo lang ng yes or no yung statement, kung ano yung tinatanong ng statement. Okay? So, para lang siyang true or false. Ano? Yes, if the statement is true, and no, if the statement is false. So, you just put a checkbox corresponding to your answer. Okay, for the next activity, so this will be your pick me. So the direction is below are the 5 preparations a researcher must do in order to make a conceptual framework. Shade the number for the first step. Shade the number 1 for the first step, 2 for the second, 3 for the third, 4 for the fourth, and 5 for the last step to pick the answer. So, kanina pinag-usapan natin yung iba't ibang steps na paggawa ng conceptual framework. So, dito you're just going to be identifying ano bang step 1, ano bang step 2, step 3, step 4, and step 5. So, shade nyo lang or identify nyo or sulat nyo sa answer sheet nyo kung ano ba yung step given. 1 pag first, 2 pag second, 3 pag third, 4 for fourth, at 5 for fifth. Okay, now for the next activity, so the direction is in this activity, you need to find at least 5 words related to conceptual framework and describe each based on how you remember it. So para dito, marami tayong terms na ginamit kanina during our discussion. I want you to find 5 words that are actually discussed na pinag-usapan natin about conceptual framework. And aside from that, pag nahanap nyo, I also want you to describe or define each based on how you remember that word during our discussion. Okay, now for the next activity, the direction is, for this activity, you need to define the underlined words from the given context that is based from the given situation. You have to give its meaning. Read the sentences carefully. So para dito, read the different sentences or different situations, and I want you to define the underlined words or phrases basing on the concept or dun the context ng situation. Okay? Okay, for the next activity, so the direction is place a check mark on the corresponding box of your answer. If the statement is correct about the purpose of conceptual framework, check agree. If the statement is incorrect, check disagree. So, meron tayong 5 statements dito. So, ang gagawin nyo lang, kung correct ba, okay, kung correct ba yung ating statement about conceptual framework, checkan nyo yung agree. At kung incorrect, checkan nyo yung disagree. Okay, now let's proceed with the next activity. The direction is create a research framework that will serve as the paradigm of the given research title. Use IVDV, IVMB, IVDV, or IPO model. So dito, meron kayong topic for research, and I want you to construct a conceptual framework related to this particular topic. So, meron tayong tatlong topic dito. So, pwede kayong gumamit ng IVDV framework, IVMV, IVDV framework, or yung IPO model. Depende na sa inyo yan. Na? Okay, and now for our assessment. So, ang assessment natin is a simple multiple choice. Each question has 4 answer choices. Read each question and answer carefully. Choose the best answer for each number. So, meron tayong 15 items dito. So, you just write the letter of your answer. Okay, so that concludes our discussion about conceptual framework. Now, bago natin tapusin, okay, yung lesson natin, pag-usapan muna natin yung learning activity sheet na gagawin nyo for week 7. So, ito yon. Okay? So, ang title ng ating uh, learning activity sheet is Making My Own Conceptual Framework. So, what is the objective of this learning activity sheet? Is for you to explain the content of a conceptual framework. And number 2, create a conceptual framework from given statement of the problem. Okay, so basahin nyo ito mabuti, ano? So, discuss na lang natin kung ano yung activity na gagawin nyo. Now, so procedure. Following the IPO model for conceptual framework, use the given statement of the problem to create a research paradigm. You can use the diagram below. So, dito specifically ang gagamitin nyo yung IPO model, Input, Process, and Output Model for Conceptual Framework. So, ito yung statement of the problem natin. Using the statement of the problem, gamit yung statement of the problem natin, you're going to be constructing your conceptual framework. So, identify nyo kung ano yung input, ano yung process, at ano yung output. Again, you have to base it on the statement of the problem given. Okay, next, for the analysis, we have questions here. So, question number 1, what should be written in the input, process, and output box of a research paradigm? Ano ba yung kailangan natin isulat sa input, sa process, and output box of a research paradigm? So question number 2, does the research paradigm you created represent the outline of the research? Explain your answer. So sulat nyo na lang yung sagot nyo directly on your learning activity sheets. Para sa generalization natin, ito, number 1, what is a conceptual framework? So explain in your own words. Ano ba ang pagkakaintindi mo tungkol sa conceptual framework? Again, write your answer directly on your learning activity sheets. Number 2, what are the contents of the conceptual framework? Ano ba ang nilalaman ng conceptual framework? Next, for the application, how important is conceptual framework in a research? So, try to explain bakit importante ang pag-formulate ng conceptual framework sa isang research. Okay, and for the last one, sa enrichment activity natin, you are now going to be constructing your own conceptual framework. So, using the research topic na ginawa niyo before. So, I want you to construct your own conceptual framework. Again, sulat nyo na lang or drawing nyo na lang or illustrate nyo na lang yung conceptual framework nyo on the space, sa space dito sa ating learning activity sheet. Okay. Now, that concludes finally our discussion for today. Again, good luck sa inyong lahat and I will be seeing you again on our next topic. Thank you sa lahat.